Cole Mercer stepped out of a worn pickup truck in front of Willow Creek Golf Club wearing a faded denim jacket, work boots caked with red clay, and a baseball cap with a fraying brim. The parking lot stretched around him like a museum of quiet wealth. A slate-gray Bentley Continental beside a white Porsche Cayenne, a row of Range Rovers lined up like sentinels at parade rest. Every vehicle gleamed as though the morning sun had been hired to polish them. Cole's truck sat among them like a folding chair at a black-tie dinner. He didn't adjust his jacket. He didn't check his reflection in anyone's tinted window. He simply pulled a thin envelope from his chest pocket, tucked it under his arm, and walked toward the entrance as though the distance between the gravel and the glass doors was the only thing on his mind. Tyler Knox spotted him first from the covered valet area, where he stood with two associates adjusting his cuffs. Tyler was the kind of man who believed that appearance was argument, that the quality of a person's suit was a reliable proxy for the quality of their thinking. He took one look at Cole's boots, at the worn knees of his jeans, at the absence of a golf bag or a caddy or any of the usual accessories of belonging, and he laughed. Not a private laugh, a public one aimed outward, designed to be heard. Somebody tell maintenance the back entrance is over there. His associates smiled the way people smile when they're not entirely sure a joke is funny but understand that laughing costs them nothing. Claire Vaughn was standing near the reception desk, reviewing a printed agenda when she heard it. She looked up, found Cole with her eyes, held the gaze for a moment, then leaned toward Brooke Ellis, the club's head of member services. "Is he actually on the guest list?" she asked, quietly but without much effort to conceal the question. Brooke glanced at the list on the podium. She scanned it twice. Cole reached the door, held it open for an older woman exiting with a tennis bag, and stepped inside. He said nothing to any of them. Brooke found his name 12 seconds later, not in the standard guest column, but in a separate access tier she rarely consulted, one labeled Private Board Access, reserved for principals, backers, and individuals who had specifically requested that their attendance not be announced. She stared at it for a moment. Cole was already at the bar, asking for a black coffee. The clubhouse at Willow Creek was designed to feel like money that didn't need to explain itself. Dark walnut paneling, leather that had been broken in rather than bought new, oil paintings of Scottish lynx on misty mornings. The carpet was the color of old moss, thick enough to muffle every footstep, which meant that every conversation happened at a slightly lower volume than necessary, as though the room itself expected discretion. Cole sat at a small corner table near the window and watched the fairway outside, where the morning dew was still burning off in pale sheets of vapor. He thought about Paige. She had said something once, driving past a country club near the highway, watching the sprinklers arc over the perfectly maintained green. She'd said that the most beautiful places in the world had a way of making ordinary people feel like trespassers in their own country. He had told her that only applied if you let them. She had laughed and said, "Easy for you to say." He thought she'd been right, and that he hadn't given her answer the credit it deserved. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and let the warmth settle. Across the room, Tyler Knox was holding court at the fireplace, gesturing with a crystal glass of water, as though it were a prop. He was louder than the room asked him to be, the particular loudness of someone who needed the room to understand they were important before anyone had agreed to the premise. Cole watched him and said nothing. He was good at watching without appearing to. It was a skill he'd developed not in boardrooms but in hangars, where you learn to assess a machine's condition not by its documentation but by the way it sat at rest. The event had been organized under a discrete heading in the club's quarterly calendar: Vaughn Medical Systems, Private Investment Consultation. The assembled guests included a regional private equity group, 3 representatives from a hospital development council, 2 attorneys from a firm that specialized in nonprofit governance, and Warren Hale, a retired aviation executive who had consulted on medical logistics for over 2 decades, and Cole, though only Warren knew why. The stated purpose of the gathering was to evaluate a funding proposal for a rural healthcare expansion project, a network of small clinics, remote diagnostic stations, and critically, a system of medical helicopter landing pads that would allow emergency transport to reach communities currently cut off by terrain, distance, or simply the economics of ambulance deployment. Claire Vaughn had spent 14 months building the framework. She believed in it. It was the most personal project she had led, and also the most vulnerable, because it required her to ask for money from people who calculated return before they calculated impact. Tyler Knox was her lead financial strategist, a man she had hired for his ability to make large numbers feel inevitable, and who had a habit of rounding inconvenient figures down to the nearest agreeable integer. He had spent the week before the meeting quietly suggesting to Claire that certain elements of the rural component, the most remote landing sites, the clinics serving populations with the lowest insurance coverage, might be repositioned as Phase 2 or Phase 3 or as aspirational language rather than binding commitment. Claire had not agreed. She also had not yet refused. Tyler Knox was still talking. Cole looked at him over the rim of his coffee cup and then looked out the window again. Warren Hale came in through a side corridor and stopped when he saw Cole. His face registered recognition, then something close to relief, and then a careful neutrality as Cole gave the smallest possible shake of his head. The kind that says not yet, wait, let it ride. Warren picked up a glass of water from a passing tray and moved to the far end of the room as though he had never seen Cole before in his life. Cole appreciated the man's discipline. Brooke approached the table, still carrying the unease of the earlier moment. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I apologize for the confusion at the entrance." Cole shook his head slightly. "No confusion," he said. "I found the coffee." She nodded and retreated. Tyler noticed the exchange from across the room, and because he was a man who categorized by hierarchy, and because Cole's jacket remained inconsistent with his model, he filed the interaction under anomaly rather than significance. He would regret this. The morning light was moving across the fairway in long gold bars, and somewhere above the tree line, past the edge of the manicured grass where the estate land gave way to the rougher geography of the surrounding county, a cloud was building. Cole noticed it the way he noticed most things. Not with alarm, just with registration. The business of being ignored has a particular texture. It is not violent. It doesn't announce itself. It happens in the way a room rearranges around a person, in the careful geometry of who faces whom, in the topics that rise and fall just out of their earshot, in the offers of coffee that arrive last or not at all. Cole was familiar with it. He did not take it personally. He had been in rooms far more hostile than a golf clubhouse, and had simply waited for the room to update its assumptions. He ordered a second coffee. At the table nearest the fireplace, Tyler Knox had gathered 3 of the private equity representatives and was walking them through a revised version of Claire's proposal, his version, which he had printed separately and placed in crisp folders overnight. His version was cleaner, more geometric. The loss ratios were better, the coverage maps were smaller, the return projections were higher. Tyler was a man who believed that any problem could be solved by removing the parts that didn't perform, which was a reasonable philosophy for machinery and a catastrophic one for healthcare. "You know this isn't a public driving range, right?" Tyler called across the room at one point, pitching his voice just loud enough to reach Cole's table without technically being directed at it. Cole looked up. "I know," he said, not defensive, not wounded. Just a statement of fact delivered at the same temperature as the room. Tyler smiled and turned back to his folder. Claire Vaughn was in a private anteroom off the main hall, reviewing her presentation slides on a tablet while Naomi Park, her project director, stood nearby reviewing her own notes. Claire was composed in the way of someone who had learned, Through years of high-stakes rooms, that emotion was a resource to be deployed rather than leaked. She was not unkind. She was careful. And right now, she was carrying the particular tension of someone who had committed to something good and was watching the conditions around it shift in increments she hadn't authorized. "Have someone re-verify the Mercer access," she told Naomi quietly. "I don't want an image situation if he's not correctly credentialed." Naomi went to check and returned 3 minutes later with an expression that suggested she had found something unexpected. "He's listed under private backer access," she said, "separate from the standard VIP register." Claire looked up from her tablet. "What does that mean?" "It means he was invited directly," Naomi said. "Not through the event coordinator, through whoever manages the Foundation's principals list." Claire set the tablet down. She thought for a moment, and then she returned to her slides, but something had shifted slightly in her attention. Across the hall, Cole was watching Tyler in the way that Cole watched most things that concerned him. Without expression, without movement. With the specific quality of stillness that Paige had once called his maintenance mode. Because it was the face he wore when he was deciding whether something needed to be repaired or replaced. He had already heard Tyler use the phrase low return population twice in 40 minutes. He had heard it once before, years ago, in a government aviation contract meeting, where a consultant had used it to explain why certain communities didn't warrant emergency helicopter coverage. Cole had walked out of that meeting and never returned the man's calls. Now he sat with the phrase and let it define the morning. Naomi had circled back near the fireplace area to collect some folders and happened to pause close enough to notice that Cole's attention, while apparently idle, had been tracking every word of Tyler's informal pre-briefing. She watched him for a moment. He wasn't angry. He wasn't performing patience. He was simply present in a way that most people in that room were not, because most of them were also performing success, performing certainty, performing the easy confidence of people who had never needed to be in a room they weren't already respected in. Cole needed none of that. It showed. Naomi made a small mental note and returned to Claire. Later, near the main corridor, Cole overheard Tyler telling a council representative that the real challenge with Claire's project was that it attracted visionary language over structural discipline. Cole took out his phone and typed a brief message to his son Nolan. "You were right. People show you exactly who they are when they think they're talking to someone who doesn't matter." He sent it and put the phone away. Nolan would understand. He was 17 and already more perceptive than most adults Cole had met, which was perhaps unsurprising, given that he had grown up watching his father walk into rooms dressed like a contractor and leave them having changed everything. Cole finished the coffee. Outside the window, the cloud above the tree line had grown. The presentation was scheduled to begin at 11. At 10:45, the main conference room, a wide, high-ceiling space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the 18th green, began to fill. Claire's team had set up a projection screen, a speaker system, and a centered podium with the Vaughn Medical Systems logo printed in clean navy blue. The chairs arranged before it were the kind of chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent and were upholstered in the same dark leather as the rest of the clubhouse, as though even the furniture had been briefed on the occasion. Cole took a seat in the second row near the window. The project was called the Vaughn Rural Care Network. Claire had conceived it 3 years ago after a hospital systems review revealed that 12% of the surrounding county's population lived more than 45 minutes from the nearest emergency medical facility, and that in the mountainous north section, that number climbed to over an hour and 20 minutes. The solution she had designed was threefold: a network of small-scale rural clinics staffed by rotating physicians, a telemedicine backbone connecting those clinics to the regional hospital system, and critically, a series of certified helicopter landing pads at each clinic site, enabling emergency air transport when ground vehicles couldn't arrive in time. The foundation funding she was seeking would cover the construction and 2-year operational cost of the landing pad system. The private equity participation she was courting would fund the clinic infrastructure. Tyler's job had been to make the financial architecture attractive enough to secure both. The problem was that Tyler had begun to see the landing pads, the humanitarian core of the project, as a liability, not because they didn't work, but because they served communities that couldn't pay back. He had spent the week before the gathering restructuring the proposal so that the landing pad system was listed as optional infrastructure, subject to Phase 2 review. Claire had not fully reviewed the restructured version. That was a mistake she would recognize before the day was over. Cole listened to the pre-meeting conversation around him. A council member mentioned projected patient volumes. A private equity representative asked about insurance coding and reimbursement frameworks. Tyler was at the front of the room, gesturing at a slide that showed the project's coverage map, a map that, Cole noted, was missing 6 of the 14 rural sites he had reviewed in the original foundation summary. He leaned forward slightly. Tyler was explaining that the revised footprint reflected operational pragmatism. Then Cole spoke, not loudly, clearly. "If a person doesn't generate a return," he said, "are they still worth saving?" The room adjusted around the question. Tyler turned. He found Cole and allowed himself a small, performative patience. "That's a very philosophical question from someone in work boots," he said. There were a few nervous smiles. Claire's expression did not change, but something moved behind her eyes. A flicker of recognition that the question, however it had been delivered, had landed in the exact place she had been avoiding for the past 3 days. Naomi, standing at the side of the room, saw it and said nothing. Cole nodded once, as though Tyler's non-answer had answered something else entirely. He settled back in his chair and looked again at the coverage map on the wall, at the white space where 6 communities used to be, at the clean lines of a proposal that was about to be sold as progress. Outside, from somewhere beyond the trees, there was a low and rhythmic sound. A few people near the window looked up. A club employee leaned into the doorway and addressed the room with professional calm. The designated landing area behind the east terrace would need to be kept clear for the remainder of the afternoon, as a private aviation arrival was expected. Tyler smiled. He assumed the arrival was a late conversing investor from the city. He was building his next sentence in his head already, something about momentum, something about alignment. He was very good at sentences about momentum. Her name had been Paige Mercer, and she had been an emergency flight nurse for 9 years before she became Cole's wife, and then Cole's partner in something larger than either of them had originally planned. She had been the kind of person who made a room better by entering it, not through performance, but through the quality of her attention, the way she listened as though the person in front of her was the most interesting problem she had encountered all week. She had been the one who showed Cole what it looked like when a system failed a person. The moment had happened on a Thursday evening in a county 3 hours north of where they lived. A farmer named Harold had suffered a cardiac event in a field at 5 in the afternoon. The nearest ambulance was 48 minutes away. There was a medical helicopter in the region, but its landing clearance in that county required a form that hadn't been updated in 6 years, and so the crew had waited at the airfield for 11 minutes for authorization that should have taken 2. Harold died before they arrived. Paige had been on the receiving end of the radio call. She had not spoken about it for 3 days. Then she had come to Cole at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning and laid out in careful handwriting on a legal pad everything she thought was wrong with rural emergency aviation coverage, the regulatory gaps, the funding structures, the landing site deficits, the 40-year-old presumption that some places were simply too far to be worth a rapid response infrastructure. Cole had been a systems engineer working on rotorcraft navigation and safety integration. He had spent his career making helicopters smarter. He read her legal pad notes and recognized in them the shape of a problem he could actually solve. They had spent 2 years building the concept together, a privately funded network of community helicopter landing pads, each certified for medical use, each connected to a regional dispatch system that could cut authorization time from minutes to seconds. Page called it the short-circuit approach. You removed the friction, not the capability. She was diagnosed with an aggressive form of pancreatic cancer 13 months after they filed the Foundation's incorporation papers. She lived for 11 more months. In that time, she continued working on the project when she was well enough to sit upright, which was less often than either of them pretended. She made Cole promise 3 things: that he would finish it, that he wouldn't let grief make him small, and that he would raise Nolan to understand that the measure of a person was found in what they chose to do when no one was watching, and there was nothing to gain. Cole had kept all 3 promises to varying degrees of success. He had finished it, the Foundation now operating in 4 states with 62 active landing sites. He had not let grief make him small, though it had made him quiet in ways he was still learning to distinguish from peace. And Nolan was 17 and argued about ethical frameworks at the dinner table, and had once, at 14, corrected a university professor's lecture notes on humanitarian logistics, politely but with sources. Cole thought Page would have been proud, and also not remotely surprised. He had sold 3 navigation patents after she died and used the proceeds to establish the Foundation's endowment. He had kept the house, kept the old truck, kept the work clothes he'd worn in the years when he and Page had driven out to rural sites together to walk the ground and talk to clinic staff and stand in empty fields imagining where a helicopter might someday land. He wore them still because they were not a costume. They were a record. In his jacket pocket, on a small titanium ring with no other keys attached, he carried the lanyard tag from the last helicopter Page had ever flown in as a patient, the one that had brought her home for the last time. He turned it over with his thumb whenever the room needed reminding that it was not as important as it thought it was. He was turning it over now as Tyler Knox, 40 feet away, drew a red marker through 6 sites on a coverage map. The meeting resumed after a brief recess, and Tyler made his move with the clean efficiency of someone who had timed it carefully. As the investors settled and Claire returned from a call, Tyler distributed the alternate proposal, the one with the restructured coverage map, the revised phase timelines, the landing pad system flagged as discretionary. He moved quickly, placing folders, summarizing key points, building the architecture of consensus, before Claire had fully read the document in her hands. Cole watched the room adjust. 2 of the private equity representatives were already nodding. The council members were comparing pages. Claire was reading with a frown that she was trying not to show. Then Tyler looked at Cole and said, with the pleasantness of someone who has decided to be generous, "I think we should probably continue this portion with confirmed stakeholders only." For clarity, he meant it as a removal, not loud, not aggressive, just the quiet, well-dressed exclusion of someone whose boots didn't belong in a deal room. Brooke Ellis, standing near the entrance, looked between them. Cole did not move. He held up the envelope he had carried in. "I received an invitation," he said. Tyler reached for it, examined it, and then showed it to the man beside him with the expression of someone who has found a forgery. "Anyone can write a letter," he said. Claire looked up from the folder in her hands. Naomi was already moving toward Warren Hale across the room. "Security would be happy to wait with you outside," Tyler said. "We'll reach out after the meeting if there are follow-up items to discuss." Cole stood. He was not tall in a way that commanded attention, but he had the stillness of someone who had stood in aircraft hangars and operating rooms and small-town hospital waiting areas and learned that the spaces which most needed dignity were the ones least likely to receive it. "I only want to know one thing," he said. "Is this how you treat everyone who doesn't look like you expect them to?" Tyler smiled in the practiced way of a man who was about to say something cutting. "We have standards here," he said. "That's the whole point." Cole looked at Claire. "Then let's hope your standards run deeper than his suit." The room was not comfortable. Claire opened her mouth and closed it again. Her CEO training told her to manage the optics. Something else, something she hadn't needed to consult in a while, told her to be quiet and pay attention. Tyler gestured toward the door, and then the glass in the windows vibrated. A deep, percussive beat rolled through the room, growing from a murmur into something that rattled the coffee cups on their saucers. Everyone near the window turned. Outside, descending slowly over the tree line at the eastern edge of the property, was a helicopter. It was not the helicopter anyone had imagined. It was not a charter luxury transport with a leather interior and a corporate logo embossed in gold. It was a medical-grade transport helicopter in white and deep marine blue, clean and purposeful and modern in the way of equipment that exists to do something rather than impress anyone. Its fuselage carried 2 words in bold lettering: Mercer Air Rescue. The rotor wash bent the grass of the fairway in long sweeping arcs as it descended toward the designated landing area behind the east terrace. The VIP guests had migrated to the window and the terrace doors without discussing it, drawn by the sound and the motion and the particular magnetism of a machine that large, moving that close to the ground. Tyler was among them. He watched the helicopter settle onto its skids and studied the logo on its side with an expression that was trying to resolve a contradiction. The side door opened, and a pilot in a blue flight suit stepped down. Not to the aircraft, but past it, across the terrace stone, through the glass door that a staff member held open, and directly into the conference room. He walked past Tyler without stopping. He walked past Claire. He stopped in front of Cole Mercer, whose coffee cup was still on the table, whose jacket still had a small stain of red clay on the left cuff, who had not moved from his chair. "Mr. Mercer," the pilot said. "Board call was moved up. They need you at the hospital site for the landing pad clearance review before tonight's weather comes in." The room did not speak for a full 4 seconds. It was Tyler Knox who broke it, and when he spoke his voice had lost its polish. "Mercer," he said. Warren Hale, standing at the back of the room, looked down at his water glass, exhaled once through his nose, and said quietly but clearly, "Cole Mercer, founder of the Mercer Air Rescue Foundation." Claire Vaughn put down the folder. She looked at the helicopter outside. She looked at the man in the worn denim jacket and the clay-caked work boots who had been offered a seat outside security 40 seconds ago. She did not speak. Cole looked at the pilot. "Any medical urgency or just the weather assessment?" The pilot shook his head. "Weather assessment. The site manager wants sign-off on the approach path modifications before the front moves in tonight." Cole nodded. He reached for his jacket and turned to Claire. The coverage map was still on the wall, Tyler's version, with the 6 missing sites. "That's the part of your project Tyler calls low return," Cole said, nodding toward the empty white spaces on the map. "I'm going there now to make sure the landing pad can receive a helicopter in a crosswind, so that if someone has a heart attack at 5 in the afternoon in a field up there, they don't have to wait." He picked up his coffee cup, finished what was left in it, and set it back down. Tyler said nothing. His folder was still in his hand. Claire said, "Wait," and then, "Can I come?" The flight took 40 minutes. They flew north-northeast over the neat parcels of irrigated farmland that gave way first to rougher pasture and then to a landscape of low ridges and rock outcroppings and pine-dark valleys that the interstate never touched. From 500 feet, the county looked like 2 different countries sharing a border. On one side, the geometry of development, subdivisions, retail corridors, the blue rectangles of suburban swimming pools catching the afternoon light. On the other, the older country, scattered houses along unpaved roads, a water tower with the town's name painted in fading letters, creek beds running beside single-lane bridges, a school with a gravel parking lot where 24 cars were parked with the patient permanence of places that hadn't been updated in 20 years. Naomi sat beside Claire. Cole sat opposite, facing back, watching the terrain the way he had always watched terrain, as a problem to be mapped, a gap to be bridged, a distance that meant something specific to a person having the worst day of their life. Claire pressed her palm to the window glass. "How far is the nearest hospital from here?" she asked. "Ground transport," Cole said. 1 hour and 12 minutes on a good day. 1 hour and 40 if there's snow on the mountain road. Claire watched the land below. Tyler said the per capita return on these sites was negative. "Yes," Cole said, "it is, so he wasn't wrong about the numbers. He was wrong about what the numbers mean," Cole said. He wasn't angry. He was explaining something he had explained before, in other rooms, to other people who had confused the cost of a thing with the value of it. A landing pad in a community of 300 people costs the same to build as one in a community of 30,000. The return per capita is lower. The return per life saved is identical. Claire was quiet. Naomi looked at her notes and then out the window. Below them, a gravel road wound up a ridge toward a low building with a red cross painted on the roof. The clinic. Beside it, a marked rectangle of cleared land waited in the afternoon light. The helicopter set down on the cleared pad with the smooth, particular competence of a machine in the hands of someone who has landed in worse. A man in a light jacket and work pants was waiting at the edge. Dr. Henry Shaw, the clinic's lead physician, who had been petitioning the county health authority for improved emergency transport access for 4 years. He shook Cole's hand and looked at the sky behind them with professional concern. "Front's moving in faster than forecast," he said. "If we can confirm the southwest approach is clean, I can file the updated certification tonight." Cole walked the perimeter of the pad with him, examining the approach path, checking sight lines, noting a row of young trees at the southwest edge that had grown in the past 18 months and would need trimming before the pad's flight clearance could be renewed. Practical, concrete, boring work. The kind that saved lives in the specific, unheroic, invisible way that most life-saving happened. Claire watched from the clinic doorway. Dr. Shaw came to stand beside her while Cole and the pilot walked the pad. "If this site gets cut from the project," Shaw said without looking at her, "we go back to ground only. Best case scenario, someone survives because they happen to have a neighbor with a car. Worst case, they're an hour too late, and that's that." He said it without drama. It was just geography. He had seen it both ways. Claire had been holding herself together with the careful structure of executive composure, but the altitude and the wind and the bluntness of the doctor's arithmetic were doing something to the architecture of that composure. She thought about the coverage map. She thought about Phase 2. She thought about Tyler's revised folder with its clean numbers and its white spaces. Then Naomi showed her the email on her phone. The one Tyler had sent at 9:47 that morning to 2 of the private equity principals, proposing a restructured funding model that removed the rural landing pad component from the binding agreement and relocated it to a discretionary appendix. He had not asked Claire. He had not flagged it. He had simply begun the quiet, professional dismantling of the part of her project she cared about most, with the confidence of someone who had calculated that she would ratify the result once it was presented to her as a fait accompli. Claire read the email twice. Then she put the phone in her pocket and stood in the wind at the top of a ridge above a community of 300 people and felt the specific, clarifying weight of a decision that had already made itself. Cole finished the pad assessment and returned to where she stood. He did not ask what she'd found. He said, I don't fund organizations that pose with their philanthropy and bill for the convenience. It landed the way simple, true things land, without softening, without anger aimed precisely. I know, Claire said. I know that's what this was becoming. Cole looked at her. Was, he said, past tense. She met his eyes. Past tense, she said. They returned to Willow Creek as the afternoon light was going gold and amber over the fairways, and the shadow of the clubhouse stretched long across the first tee. The helicopter settled onto the landing area with the same unhurried certainty as before, and the guests who had remained, and most had remained, because something in the morning's events had made the room unwilling to disperse, watched it from the terrace in silence. Claire stepped down from the helicopter before Cole and walked directly into the conference room, where Tyler Knox was still fielding quiet questions from the two private equity representatives he had been cultivating. She asked everyone else to give them a moment and then closed the door. The conversation inside lasted 11 minutes. No one outside could hear it clearly, but Tyler's body language through the glass was that of a man who had prepared arguments for a negotiation and discovered mid-sentence that the negotiation was over. When the door opened, Tyler collected his folder and his two alternate proposals and his revised coverage maps and left the clubhouse without speaking to anyone. He did not take the valet. He walked to his car himself, which was perhaps the most honest thing he had done all day. Claire returned to the conference room and asked Brooke to invite the full group back in. When they were assembled, she stood at the front of the room and spoke without notes. She said that the Vaughan Rural Care Network was returning to its original design. All 14 clinic sites, all 14 landing pad locations, including the 6 that had been removed from the morning's proposal without her knowledge or consent. She said that the funding framework would be revised to reflect those commitments in binding rather than discretionary language. She said that she owed an apology to a man who had been treated with contempt in this room by people who should have known better, herself included for not speaking sooner. She looked at Cole, who was standing near the window with his hands in the pockets of his jacket. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not because I know what you're worth, because I let someone else's judgment substitute for my own, and you deserved better than that the moment you walked in." Cole nodded once. "Apology accepted," he said. Then he looked around the room, at the private equity partners, the council members, the club staff standing near the entrance, Warren Hale with his water glass. "The apology I'd ask for is a different one," he said. "Don't apologize to me because it turns out I'm worth something. Apologize for the part where you decided someone dressed like this wasn't worth basic courtesy. Those aren't the same thing." The room absorbed that. A few people found the carpet suddenly interesting. Warren Hale looked directly at Cole and gave the small, contained nod of a man who had agreed with something for a long time and was glad to finally hear it said out loud. Cole turned to Claire. "You want to talk about the agreement terms?" he said. "I want to talk about the agreement terms," she said. Warren brought 2 chairs together near the window. Naomi opened her laptop. Outside, the evening was coming in from the north, and the sky above the ridge country had gone the particular deep blue that precedes a weather front. Dark and clear and serious, the kind of sky that reminds you the world is larger than whatever room you're currently standing in. The agreement that Naomi drafted that evening in the Willow Creek conference room was 7 pages long and covered 3 areas with precision that Tyler's version had deliberately avoided. The first was scope. All 14 clinic sites would be included in the binding agreement, with the landing pad infrastructure classified as primary infrastructure rather than supplementary, and with specific completion milestones for each site. The second was governance. Mercer Air Rescue Foundation would hold observer status on the project's implementation board, with the right to flag compliance concerns directly to the principal funders. The third was the clause that Claire had added herself, quietly, after returning from the ridge. No site could be removed from the coverage map without a public record justification filed with the county health authority. It was a small thing bureaucratically. It was an enormous thing in practice. Cole read the 7 pages standing at the window, made 2 minor edits with a pen Naomi handed him, and signed at the bottom of the last page. Claire signed beneath him. The 2 private equity partners, who had spent the afternoon recalibrating, signed after. Warren Hale witnessed. Brooke Ellis notarized. The whole process took less than 20 minutes, which was, Cole thought, exactly how long it should take when everyone in the room finally means the same thing. He rolled the pen between his fingers for a moment, then handed it back to Naomi. The evening had settled fully by the time the last of the guests filtered out of the clubhouse and into the cooling air of the parking lot, where the Bentleys and Porsches and Range Rovers were now illuminated by the soft amber of the lot's ground lighting. The helicopter sat in the cleared area behind the east terrace like a quiet piece of punctuation, a period at the end of a long sentence. Claire found Cole outside near the terrace railing, looking out at the fairway where the mist was beginning to gather again in the low places. She stood beside him for a moment without speaking, which was something she was learning from him in real time, the permission to let silence hold the weight it needed to hold. She looked at his jacket. The clay stain was still on the cuff. The cap was back on his head, brim soft, creases familiar, the artifact of 100 mornings that had nothing to do with golf clubs or investment meetings. "You could wear a suit," she said finally. "You could afford one that would make Tyler Knox look underdressed." "I could," he said. "Why don't you?" He kept his eyes on the horizon line where the trees met the sky in a ragged edge that the darkness was slowly erasing. "Because I want to know how people see me when they think I have nothing to offer them," he said. "That's the real information. Everything else is theater." Claire looked at the horizon too. Below the ridge, invisible from here, the clinic sat at the end of its gravel road, its red cross facing the sky, its cleared landing pad waiting for a weather certification that would now be filed by morning. 300 people in that valley would go to sleep tonight no closer to knowing what had happened at a golf club 40 miles south of them. They would wake up tomorrow and drive the same roads and work the same land and call the same understaffed clinic when they needed help. But something in the architecture of their access had shifted, quietly, in a room they would never see, by a man in work boots they would never meet. Cole turned from the railing. The pilot was already at the helicopter, running the pre-flight sequence, the instruments casting a faint blue glow across the landing area. "I need to get to the site before the front moves in," Cole said. He picked up his coffee cup from the railing. He had carried it outside at some point, and Claire hadn't noticed, and set it on the lip of a planter box. "Good luck with the implementation," he said. "I'll be in touch through Warren." He walked toward the helicopter with the same unhurried purpose with which he had walked across the parking lot that morning, past the Bentleys and the Porsches and the Range Rovers, past the laughter of a man who had looked at his boots and decided they told the whole story. The rotor began to turn, slowly at first, then with the building urgency of something preparing for altitude. A few guests who had lingered on the terrace stopped talking. A couple near the valet stand turned to watch. Brooke Ellis, standing just inside the glass door, held the door open without entering, watching the blue and white machine prepare to lift. Tyler Knox was not there to see it. Cole Mercer climbed in, pulled the door shut, and the helicopter rose, unhurried, purposeful, tilting slightly north as it gained altitude, the landing lights sweeping once across the fairway below, before the machine turned and climbed above the tree line and disappeared into the dark above the ridge country where the weather was coming in, and where, in a valley 300 people called home, a landing pad was waiting for the certification that would make it real. The people who had laughed that morning stood in the cooling air of the parking lot, and watched the sky where the helicopter had been. They didn't speak for a moment. The sound faded. The mist moved across the grass. The lights of the clubhouse were warm behind them, and the fairway stretched away into the dark, immaculate and still, and the night was very quiet in the way that nights become quiet after something true has been said in a room that wasn't used to it. A man had walked in wearing old clothes and boots with clay on them, carrying a thin envelope and a titanium keyring, and a silence that none of them had known how to read. He had not argued with them. He had not revealed himself to impress them. He had sat with his coffee and watched and waited for the room to become what it was, and then he had left in a helicopter bearing the name of the woman he had promised to finish what she started. And he had not looked back, because people who are doing something real rarely need to. The measure of Cole Mercer was not in his net worth, not in his patents, not in the 62 landing sites operating under his foundation's certification. It was in the farmer in the valley who would not know his name, in the physician on the ridge who would file the certification by morning, in the 18 people in that community who, in the next 2 years, would need a helicopter and find one there. None of them would know a thing about Willow Creek Golf Club, or the man in the old denim jacket, or what it cost him in patience and silence and restraint to walk into that room and wait for the world to catch up. That was exactly how he would have wanted it.